day everyone. How are you? How have you been? So before we start our discussion, I would like to ask you a few simple questions such as how are you as a student and what techniques, methods, or strategies do you use to learn more effectively or efficiently in class? Now give yourself some time to answer these questions because it is um, related to our topic at hand, which is managing and caring for the self. My name is Charia, but you can call me Miss Chai. I apologize for the background noise because I don't live in a quiet neighborhood. So we begin. When we learn, our brains create new connections between neurons, allowing us to remember and process new information. This process is known as neuroplasticity. It is how our brain adapts to new experiences and information because as you know that learning is a very important process for our brain to stay healthy and active. And when we learn, our brain releases chemicals such as dopamine and serotonin, which can help us feel motivated and happy. Learning changes the structure and the function of the brain. It helps us by improving our ability to think, remember, and make decisions. One example of learning is when a person is exposed to new information or experience and their behavior or understanding changes as a result. For example, when a student learns the properties of gases in a chemistry class, they may change their understanding of how gases behave, as this new knowledge affects the way they approach experiments in the future. Another example of learning is when a person acquires a new skill or ability through practice and repetition. So, for example, there's a musician who practices playing the guitar regularly. So, this practice will improve their proficiency and they will be able to play more complex pieces over time. So, learning involves making connections between new information and existing knowledge and using this information to solve problems or make decisions. So, another example is when a person who is learning how to cook may experiment with different ingredients or techniques and use their knowledge of flavor combinations and cooking techniques to create new dishes. So, overall, learning involves acquiring new knowledge, skills, or insights and using these information to make changes in behavior or understanding. So, in the next slide, you can see that there are electrical signals, yes, inside the brain between the nerves. So, these are cells that are called neurons. So, these electrical charges that are communicated from one neuron to another are called action potential or nerve impulse. These signals are generated by the movement of ions across the cell membrane of the neuron. They are responsible for transmitting information throughout the nervous system. When an action potential is generated at the axon of a neuron, it travels along the axon until it reaches the synapse, where it is transmitted to the next neuron. So this process is how the brain absorbs, comprehends, or processes the information and coordinates it to the body's responses to the stimulation it received. So, two neurons that are connected are said to form a synapse. At the synapse, one neuron, the presynaptic neuron, sends an electrical signal or action potential to the other neuron, the postsynaptic neuron. This signal is transmitted across the synapse via chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. When the action potential reaches the postsynaptic neuron, it triggers the release of transmitters which bind the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron and either excite or inhibit its activities. And this process is how neurons communicate with each other and coordinate the activity of the nervous system. So what are synapses? Synapses are small gaps between neurons or nerve cells in the brain. They are the point of communication between neurons and play a crucial role in the transmission of information in the brain. The existence of synapses is important because they allow the neurons to quickly and efficiently transmit signals from one to another. And without synapses, neurons would have to make direct physical contact to communicate, which would prove to be much slower and less efficient. Synapses allow for the flexibility and adaptability of the brain. The strength of connections between neurons, well, as you know, synapses, can change over time in response to experience, which is the process known as synaptic plasticity. This means that the brain can reorganize itself and adapt to new experiences, which is important for learning and memory. The existence of synapses, again, is important for the speed and adaptability of the brain. Although it is commonly believed that the number of synapses in the brain is related to the intelligence, there is no direct evidence to support this notion. In fact, research has shown that there is no direct correlation between the number of synapses and the cognitive abilities of the person. So in the next slide, neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change and adapt in response to new experiences and information. It is a term to describe the way that the brain reorganizes and rewires itself in response to changes and sensory input or new learning experiences. Now, Judy Willis is a neurologist and educator who is known for her research on the brain and learning. She is a board certified neurologist who has worked as a teacher and school administrator and has published numerous articles and books on the topic of brain-based learning. So, she developed a model of brain-based teaching that focuses on the use of interactive experiential and cooperative learning activities to engage students and enhance learning. According to her, neuroplasticity is the selective organizing of connections between neurons in the brain. This refers to the process by which the brain creates new connections between neurons and strengthens the existing connections in response to new experiences and information. Now, these changes in the neural connection allow the brain to process and remember new information and to adapt to changes in the environment. Neuroplasticity is an important aspect in our brain because it allows the brain to learn and adapt throughout our lives. Now, one example of neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to adapt to changes in sensory input. Yes? So, for instance, if someone loses their sight, their brain can reorganize to allow them to use other senses such as hearing and touch more effectively. This is a process known as cross-modal plasticity, and it allows the brain to compensate for changes in sensory input in order for it to continue functioning normally. In the next slide, when people stop practicing new things, the brain will eventually eliminate or prune the connecting cells that form the pathway associated with that activity. This process is known as synaptic pruning, and it is a natural part of the brain development. When we learn new things or our brain create new connection between neurons or strengthens the existing connections to process and remember the new information. However, if we do not continue to use and practice that information, our brain will eventually eliminate the connection that are created as they are no longer being used. Your brain no longer finds the information or the knowledge necessary or useful. This process of pruning will allow the brain to get rid of unnecessary connections and make room for new ones. This is the way of the brain to stay effective and efficient at processing information. Now, there are several reasons why humans forget information, experiences, or why our brain prunes unnecessary connections, such as lack of attention. If we do not pay close attention to new information when we encounter it, we may have difficulty in remembering it later. So, say for example, we are studying for an exam, and then you just, if you don't pay close attention to the key terms or what you are studying, when the time of exam comes, you might find yourself not being able to remember, or you might experience mental block. There is also interferences. When we learn new information, it can interfere with our ability to remember the similar information that we learned previously. And so, say for example, if you are learning similar terms in planting, for example, and then you realize that you can barely remember this information because what you remember is the previous information, or perhaps it's the vice versa. That is what we call interference. There is also decay. If we do not retrieve and use information regularly, they may gradually fade from our memory. This is a process known as decay. So, say for example, you believed in yourself in the stock knowledge that you possess. However, since you don't review that stock knowledge frequently, eventually you will forget it. And then there's repression. So it's not always that you forget things or your brain prunes because of your lack of attention or the decay of the information. In some cases, people may forget information or experiences because they are emotionally difficult to deal with, such as trauma. So this is what we call repression. It is the brain's defense mechanism which helps us protect ourselves from emotional distress. So in the next slide, the phrase cells that fire together wire together. This is a very common saying that is often used to describe the process of neuroplasticity, or the way that the brain changes and adapts. So this phrase means that when two neurons or cells in the brain is activated in the same time, they will form new connections or strengthen the existing connections between them. This is the process how the brain remembers the new information, and this is essential aspect again for learning and memory. The idea behind this phrase is that when the two neurons are activated at the same time, they are more likely to form a lasting connection. This is because the more often two neurons are activated together, the stronger the connections between them will become. And over time, this process of strengthening connections between neurons will allow the brain to process the new information it received more effectively. Now, when a neuron is stimulated and it fires an action potential, it is more likely to trigger the firing of the next neuron in the sequence, as the neurotransmitter release at the synapse will bind the receptors on the neuron and increase its likelihood of firing action potential. However, it is important to note that the firing of neurons is not always guaranteed. The strength of the connection between two neurons, known as synapse, can vary, and the likelihood of one neuron triggering the firing of the next will depend on the strength of the synapse. So the next statement is practice makes perfect. This is often used to describe the idea that the more we practice something, the more ingrained it becomes in our memory, and the more likely we are able to recall it in the future. This is because repeated practice helps to strengthen connections between neurons in the brain. It can make it easier for us to retrieve that information from our memory. The brain is a highly adaptable organ. It is constantly changing. So when we practice something, we simulate certain networks of neurons in the brain. And this repeated simulation can lead to changes in the strength of the connection between these neurons. So this is again what we call synaptic plasticity. And then the statement previously, practice makes permanent, is generally accurate because repeated practice can help to strengthen the connections between the neurons. However, it is important to note that the brain is again a complex organ and many factors can influence how well we remember something. So the relationship between practice and memory is not always straightforward and it's not always guaranteed. In the next slide, it is common for people to have a hard time concentrating after a long break. Say, for example, you are a student right after a vacation and you might find yourself having difficulties in writing again in the same way you used to, or getting back to your routine. This is because our brain needs time to readjust and refocus after a period of relaxation and lack of structure. When we are on a vacation, our brains are not challenged in the same way they are during on our normal routines. And as a result, it can be difficult to get back to the swing of things when we return to our regular schedule. One way to help ourselves concentrate after a long break is to gradually ease back into our routine. So, for instance, we might try to set aside a small amount of time each day in order to focus on our work or studies so that we can gradually increase our adaptability and get back to the swing of things. This will be helpful to in establishing a routine or scheduling ourselves, and this will help us stay focused and be on track. Additionally, it can help to take regular breaks in order to give our brain a chance to rest and recharge, because this will also help us again improve our concentration and focus. So, which learning strategies are more compatible with your brain? There are two strategies. One is repeatedly activating the neurons, two is spacing the activation of neurons. So, one of the key learning principles is the idea that practice makes perfect, right? This means that the more we practice or rehearse something, the better we will become at it. This is because practicing or rehearsing repeatedly activates our neurons and helps us to learn and improve. So if we want to learn something new, one of the best things that we can do is to practice or rehearse it as much as possible. So one strategy for improving the connection and focus, the concentration and the focus, is to repeatedly activate the neurons. So the more that we practice or rehearse the information or skill that we are trying to learn, we are able to um, activate the neurons that are responsible for processing the information, and this will help strengthen the connection between the neurons. Over time, this process of strengthening connections will be between the neurons will allow us to learn and improve our skills. Another way is to activate the neurons is to use memory techniques such as mnemonic devices, which are tools that can help us remember information more effectively. So mnemonic devices are based on the idea that our brain are able to better remember information that is presented in a meaningful and organized way. So, for example, you might try a mnemonic device to remember a list of items by associating each item with a word that starts with the same letter. This will help you remember the list more quickly, because it will activate the neurons in your brain that are responsible for processing that information. So, have you heard of a phrase of the word PEMDAS in mathematics? This is also a mnemonic device. PEMDAS, parenthesis, equation, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. So it is easier to remember these keywords when you put it in a phrase such as PEMDAS. So the second strategy is the spacing the activation of the neurons. Now, this means that when you practice or rehearse a skill that you are trying to learn, it had to be on regular intervals rather than trying to learn it all at once. When we pace our learning in this way, you are giving the chance, your brain, the time to process and consolidate that information, which will help you remember it more effectively. So one way to space the activation of the neurons is to use the spacing effect. This learning strategy is based on the idea that we are more likely to learn something if we study it several times over a long period rather than trying to learn it all at once. So, for instance, if you are trying to learn a new skill, or you might practice it for a short time each day rather than trying to learn that skill all at once in one day. This will allow your brain to process it and consolidate that skill more easier. Another way to space the activation of the neurons is using the forgetting curve. This is a concept in psychology that describes the way that our memory for information decreases over time. The forgetting curve suggests that we are more likely to remember something if we review it periodically rather than trying to remember it all at once. So if you are trying to remember something, you might review it several times over a long period rather than trying to remember it all at once in a short period. So this will help keep the information fresh in our minds and easier to recall. So, for the last part of our discussion, here are tips on memorizing. First is to assign meaningfulness to things, elaborating on what you are learning and applying that knowledge to something that is important to you. So, learning is the process of acquiring new knowledge, skills, or insights you experience studying or exposure to new information. One important application of learning is in education. So, by studying, practicing new concepts and skills, students can gain a deeper understanding of the world around them and develop the abilities that they need to succeed. So, learning or this tip will help the individuals develop new interests and provide a sense of accomplishment and fulfillment. So when you feel satisfied in what you are learning, or what you are learning has a meaning to you, you will find it accomplishing and you will remember it more effectively and efficiently. The second tip is learn general and specific later. This method helps with retrieval of information. So, if you know a piece of information falls within a broader category, it is easier to recall. So, general learning refers to the acquisition of broad general knowledge and skills that are applicable in a variety of situations. This type of learning is typically focused on developing a broad understanding of the subject or field rather than mastering specific details or concepts. On the other hand, no, specific learning involves acquisition of detailed specific knowledge or skills that are applicable in a particular context. Now, this type of learning is focused on mastering specific concepts or techniques and may be more specialized or narrowly focused than general learning. Now, both learning styles are important. They can complement one or another. So, for example, a student who has a broad understanding of a subject may be better able to understand and apply specific concepts within the subject. For example, a student understands philosophy in a broader level rather than specific, so they may be able to apply that knowledge more or efficiently. Similarly, mastering specific skills or knowledge can provide foundation for further or general thinking. So, say for example, as a student, you think more of the specifics. So there's a specific philosopher that you believe in. Perhaps it's Aristotle or Socrates. So you might be able to apply the philosophy of those specific philosophers in your learning. The third tip is reciting out loud in your own words until you don't need to refer to your notes anymore. So reciting words out loud can uh, help to be in memorizing information. This is an effective strategy. So when we speak, we engage in the multiple areas of our brain, including the what we call motor cortex, which is the process of sound. This multisensory stimulation can make it easier to remember information. So in addition to that, speaking out loud can help increase our attention to the information we are trying to remember. When we say words out loud, we are forced to focus on them and pay attention to their pronunciation and meaning. This will increase the attention that we have and make it easier to commit that information to memory. Furthermore, no, speaking out loud will reinforce the connection between neurons and the brain. It will be easier to remove that information from the memory when it is done so. When we say words out loud, we are activating neural networks that are responsible for processing and storing that information. This repeated activation will strengthen the connection between neurons and make the information easier to access. Now, the fourth tip is teaching someone else. Teaching the information to someone else is one of the best way to learn. If you don't have a willing listener, by the way, like your parent, your friend, or your siblings, you can teach it to the wall, and it's best if you, well, hide behind the doors, just in case you get embarrassed easily or you are shy. Now, teaching the information to someone else can be effective in learning and retaining information. This is because teaching involves actively processing and organizing information, which can help deepen our understanding of it. So when we teach, we are forced to think about the information in a different way, to break it into smaller pieces that are more manageable. This will help us identify the gaps in our understanding and to be better in organizing and structuring the information in our minds. Additionally, teaching involves explaining the information to someone else, which will help you reinforce your understanding of it. When you explain something to someone else, you are forced to think about the information clearly and logically. This will again help you organize that information and retain it in your mind. Furthermore, teaching is a collaborative process. It involves engaging with others who may have a different perspective or experiences. This will provide you valuable feedback and insights that can help you refine your understanding of the information and to see it from a new, different angle. So the fifth tip is use of memory devices. There are many different memory devices that you can use to memorize information, including acoustic, chunking, method of lossy, and flashcards. But these are not all of it. There are also mnemonic devices, as I mentioned earlier. Mnemonic devices are memory aids that you can use in combination of letters, words, or images for you to remember information easier. There are also flashcards. So flashcards are simple but effective way to memorize information because they consist of questions and prompts on one side and the answer on the other. This will help you reinforce the information and in your memory. There are also what we call mind maps. Mind maps are diagrams so that you can use to see the relationship between different pieces of information and can make it, of course, easier to remember. And then there's the repetition, the very common and effective way of memorization. This is, of course, repeating the information out loud or to yourselves in order to commit it to memory. For the sixth and final tip is to practice questions. Now, one effective way to memorize information is to practice with sample questions or quizzes. This will help you actively engage in the information and to test your understanding of it. So, to use this technique, you will have to create a set of questions that cover the information you are trying to memorize. These questions can be, of course, multiple choices, fill in the blank, or short answers, and can be designated to test your knowledge of the information. So once you have created your practice questions, you can test yourself and try to see if you can answer the questions without looking at the information. This will help you see what you already know and where you need to focus on studying. So after that you answer the questions, you can review the information and see how well you did them. And if you had difficulty with any of the questions, you can focus on studying those areas more closely. You can also create additional practice questions to test your knowledge on the information again and repeat the process until you feel confident that you have memorized the information. So there are several effective strategies for memorization of information. This includes repetition, association, visualization, chunking. What is chunking, by the way? It's said of trying to remember a large amount of information all at once. It is perhaps easier for you to break it down into smaller, more manageable chunks, which is easier to process and remember if you have hard time remembering things. There's also the mnemonic devices, as I've said earlier. So these are memory aids that in combining letters or words and images to help us remember information. But overall, the best way to memorize information is to learn your own style and type of information that you are trying to remember. The best way is to experiment with different strategies and find out what works best for you. So that is all on my tips on memorization. I hope that this discussion will help you become a better student. Thank you. Thank you for listening. That is all. This is Miss Chai signing out.